They said I was losing my mind. That stress from my medical residency was making me see things that weren't there, that my sister Melody would never hurt me. But when the toxicology report came back positive for antifreeze compounds in my bloodstream, suddenly nobody had anything to say. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Vera, and for 26 years, I lived in the shadow of my sister's smile. Melody was everything our parents wanted in a daughter. Charming, social, the kind of person who lit up rooms just by walking in. She had this way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the world, at least until the moment she decided they weren't. I was the opposite. Quiet, studious, the one who spent Friday nights with textbooks instead of boyfriends. While Melody was homecoming queen, I was getting early acceptance to medical school. While she was planning elaborate parties, I was planning my future as a pediatric surgeon. Our parents loved us both, they claimed, but love has a way of showing favorites, and Melody was always the sun while I orbited somewhere around Pluto. The family dynamics became crystal clear during our weekly Sunday dinners at Mom and Dad's house. These weren't just meals, they were performances where Melody held court, regaling everyone with stories from her job at the marketing firm, her latest romantic drama, or whatever social cause she'd temporarily adopted. I'd sit there, occasionally trying to share something about my residency, only to watch everyone's eyes glaze over the moment I mentioned medical terminology. Vera, honey, not everyone wants to hear about surgery over dinner, Mom would say with that gentle correction that felt like a knife. Meanwhile, Melody could spend 40 minutes detailing her coworker's divorce, and everyone hung on every word. But I kept showing up. Every Sunday, same routine. I'd bring homemade bread or dessert, sit in my designated spot at the corner of the table, and listen to the Melody show. It was during one of these dinners that I first noticed something was wrong. I'd been feeling off for weeks. Nausea that came in waves, dizziness that made me grip the hospital walls, fatigue that no amount of coffee could touch. My supervising physician, Dr. Martinez, had pulled me aside twice to ask if I was getting enough sleep. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was training to save lives while feeling like my own was slowly draining away. Maybe you should take a break from residency, Melody suggested one Sunday, her voice dripping with concern that somehow felt performative. You look terrible. All that stress can't be good for you. Dad nodded along. She has a point, sweetheart. Your health comes first. I wanted to tell them that taking a break wasn't an option, that pediatric surgery residencies were competitive beyond belief, that stepping away now could derail everything I'd worked for. Instead, I just smiled and said I was fine, that it was just a rough patch. That's when Melody started bringing me lunch. It began innocently enough. She'd show up at the hospital during my brief breaks with elaborate salads from trendy downtown spots, claiming she was in the neighborhood for client meetings. These weren't hospital cafeteria meals. They were beautiful, Instagram-worthy bowls with exotic grains, organic vegetables, and dressings that probably cost more than most people's entire lunch budget. You need to eat better, she'd say, watching me take the first bite. Hospital food is garbage, and you're already running yourself into the ground. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely cared for by my sister. She'd sit with me in the break room, asking about my cases, actually listening when I talked about the children I was learning to help. It felt like we were finally connecting as adults, like maybe all those years of feeling like an afterthought were behind us. The lunches became a routine. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, Melody would appear with something new and delicious, staying just long enough to make sure I ate most of it before rushing off to whatever important meeting or social engagement was next. I started looking forward to these visits, started feeling like maybe I'd misjudged my sister all these years. But the symptoms were getting worse. The nausea was constant now, accompanied by stomach cramps that bent me double in supply closets when I thought no one was looking. My hands shook during procedures, which was terrifying for someone whose career depended on steady precision. I was losing weight despite eating regularly, and my supervisor was starting to ask more pointed questions about my fitness for duty. I think you should see someone, Dr. Martinez said, after watching me nearly drop a surgical instrument during a routine procedure. This isn't just fatigue anymore, Vera. Something's wrong. I made an appointment with internal medicine, expecting them to tell me I had an ulcer or maybe some stress-related condition that would resolve with better sleep hygiene. Instead, Dr. Patterson ran a comprehensive panel and told me to come back in 3 days for results. During those 3 days, Melody's lunch visits intensified. She brought soup on Tuesday, claiming she was worried about my stomach issues. The soup was homemade, she said, a special recipe from her new cooking class. It tasted incredible, rich and savory with herbs I couldn't identify. I ate every drop, grateful for her thoughtfulness. Thursday brought another elaborate salad, this one with what she called a detox dressing that would help flush whatever was making me sick. Saturday was a protein smoothie, thick and chocolatey, designed to boost my energy levels. Each meal came with Melody's undivided attention, her concerned questions about my symptoms, her gentle suggestions that maybe I was pushing myself too hard. You know, she said during the smoothie visit, Aunt Rebecca went through something similar during her divorce. Phantom illnesses, constant fatigue, stomach problems, turned out to be anxiety manifesting physically. Maybe you should consider therapy. The suggestion stung, but I nodded along. Maybe she was right. Maybe the pressure of residency was making me physically sick. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality the way our family had always suspected I might. That's when the results came back. Dr. Patterson called me into his office with an expression I'd learned to recognize during my training. The look medical professionals get when they have to deliver news that will change everything. He had my chart open, along with several printed pages of test results. "Vera, I need you to sit down," he said, his voice careful and measured. "Your blood work shows some concerning findings." I sat, my hands gripping the chair arms as he continued. "You have elevated levels of ethylene glycol in your system. Additionally, we found traces of other compounds that shouldn't be there, things that suggest deliberate introduction rather than accidental exposure." The words hit me like a physical blow. Ethylene glycol. Antifreeze? Someone had been poisoning me. "I don't understand," I said, even though part of me absolutely did understand.
"How is that possible?" Dr. Patterson leaned forward, his expression grave. "Vera, ethylene glycol poisoning doesn't happen accidentally. Someone would have had to introduce this into your food or drink repeatedly over several weeks to create the levels we're seeing. The symptoms you've been experiencing, the nausea, dizziness, fatigue, stomach pain, they're all consistent with chronic low-level poisoning." The room seemed to tilt around me. Images flashed through my mind. Melody's concerned face as she watched me eat, her convenient appearances with meals, her suggestions about anxiety and stress, the way she always stayed to make sure I finished everything she brought. "We need to contact the police," Dr. Patterson continued. "This is attempted murder, Vera. Someone has been systematically poisoning you, and we need to find out who." I should have felt shock, should have felt fear, should have felt something other than the cold clarity that settled over me like a blanket. Instead, I felt pieces clicking into place. All those family dinners where Melody was the star, all those years of being called paranoid or dramatic when I noticed things others missed, all those conversations where my concerns were dismissed as stress or imagination. "Before we call anyone," I said quietly, "I need to make a phone call." Dr. Patterson looked confused, but he handed me the phone. I dialed my parents' number, knowing they'd both be home on a Wednesday evening, probably planning the weekend or discussing Melody's latest achievement. Mom answered on the second ring. "Vera, how are you feeling, Fenny? Melody said you looked terrible when she saw you last weekend." "Mom, I need you and Dad to sit down," I said, my voice steady despite everything churning inside me. "I just got some test results back." "Oh no, what's wrong? Is it serious? Do you need us to come to the hospital?" "I've been poisoned, Mom. Someone has been putting antifreeze in my food for weeks. The blood work proves it." Silence. Complete, deafening silence. That's impossible, Vera. You must be mistaken. Maybe the lab mixed up your results with someone else's." I'm not mistaken. Dr. Patterson ran the tests twice. Someone has been deliberately poisoning me, and I'm pretty sure I know who. Vera, honey, you're scaring me. This doesn't make sense. No one would want to hurt you. Maybe you're having some kind of breakdown. Mom. My voice cut through her rambling like a scalpel. I need you to think very carefully about what you're saying right now. Your daughter just told you she's been poisoned, and your first instinct is to suggest she's having a mental breakdown? Well, who would do such a thing? And why? It's just so hard to believe. Is Melody there? Another pause. Longer this time. She's in the kitchen. She brought dinner for us tonight. That's so sweet of her, isn't it? She's been so worried about you. Something cold settled in my chest. What did she bring? Oh, this lovely pasta salad. She made it herself, said she was practicing new recipes. She's become quite the chef lately, taking all those cooking classes. I closed my eyes, pieces of the puzzle arranging themselves into a picture so clear it was blinding. The cooking classes, the homemade meals, the concerned questions about my symptoms, followed by suggestions that I was mentally unstable. The way she always stayed to watch me eat. Mom, I need you to put the phone on speaker and call Melody into the room. Vera, I don't think this is a good idea. You're clearly upset and making accusations when you're not thinking clearly. Put the phone on speaker, now. The authority in my voice must have surprised her because I heard the click of the speaker function, followed by footsteps. Melody, honey, can you come here? Vera's on the phone. I heard my sister's voice, bright and concerned as always. Is everything okay? How is she feeling? Melody, I said, my voice carrying clearly through their kitchen, I just got my blood work back. A pause. Just a heartbeat, but in that pause, I heard everything I needed to know. Oh, and what did they find? Her voice was perfectly modulated, caring and worried in all the right ways. Oh, and what did they find? Ethylene glycol, antifreeze. Someone's been poisoning me for weeks. The silence that followed was different from Mom's shocked pause. This was the silence of someone calculating, someone deciding how to respond to an unexpected development. Oh my God, Vera, that's terrible. How could something like that happen? Do they think it was accidental? Maybe something from the hospital? Even through the phone, I could hear the performance. The slight uptick in pitch that meant she was lying, the carefully constructed concern that sounded just rehearsed enough for someone who'd been practicing. The levels in my blood suggest repeated, deliberate exposure, I said. Someone has been putting it in my food. That's horrifying, Melody replied without missing a beat. Who would do such a thing? Do you have any enemies at the hospital? Maybe a patient's family member who... The only person who's been bringing me food regularly is you. The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard Dad's voice, tentative and confused. Vera, you can't be suggesting that Melody... that's your sister. She loves you. Does she? The question hung in the air like smoke. 3 simple words that cut through decades of family mythology, decades of accepting that love looked like dismissal and care looked like control. Of course she does. Mom's voice was high and defensive now. Melody has been nothing but worried about you. She's been bringing you meals, checking on you constantly. She's been bringing me poisoned meals, Mom. She's been checking on me to make sure I'm getting sicker. Vera. Melody's voice was different now, lower and steadier. I understand you're scared and looking for explanations, but you're not thinking clearly. Stress can make people paranoid, can make them see patterns that aren't really there. I'm not paranoid. I'm poisoned. There's a difference. Are there other possibilities? Dad interjected, his voice desperate. Maybe someone at the hospital, or maybe it was accidental. Maybe there was contamination in something you ate. I could have explained the science to them, could have detailed how ethylene glycol doesn't occur naturally in food, how the levels in my blood indicated sustained exposure over weeks, how the timeline perfectly matched Melody's lunch deliveries. But I realized they didn't want scientific explanations. They wanted excuses. Dr. Patterson is calling the police, I said instead. They'll want to talk to everyone who's had access to my food. The police? Mom's voice cracked. Vera, please, let's not get authorities involved until we understand what really happened. Maybe there's been a mistake. There's been no mistake. Someone tried to kill me, and that someone is probably listening to this conversation right now. Melody laughed, actually laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Vera, listen to yourself. You think I tried to kill you? Your own sister? The person who's been taking care of you for weeks? This is exactly what I was worried about. The stress is making you delusional. And there it was. The word that had followed me through childhood, through adolescence, through every family gathering where I'd noticed something others chose to ignore. Delusional, paranoid, too sensitive, making things up. I have medical proof, I said quietly. Medical proof of poisoning, not medical proof of who did it. You're connecting dots that might not be connected, seeing conspiracy where there might just be coincidence. Mom seized on this. She's right, honey. Just because you were poisoned doesn't mean it was intentional, and certainly doesn't mean it was Melody. Maybe someone at the hospital. No one at the hospital has been feeding me. No one at the hospital watches me eat to make sure I finish everything. No one at the hospital has been asking detailed questions about my symptoms while bringing me homemade meals. I brought you meals because I was worried. Melody's voice rose, the first crack in her composure. I brought you food because you looked terrible and I thought you weren't eating properly. You brought me poisoned food because you wanted me to look terrible. The accusation hit like a physical blow. I heard Mom gasp, heard Dad murmur something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Why? The word came out broken, smaller than I intended. Why would you do this to me? And for the first time in the conversation, Melody was quiet. Really quiet. Not calculating quiet or performing quiet, but the quiet of someone who'd been asked a question they couldn't answer without revealing everything they'd been hiding. I didn't, she said finally, but her voice lacked the righteous indignation of the innocent. You're sick, Vera, but not the way you think. You need help. I am getting help. I'm getting medical help for poisoning, and I'm getting legal help for attempted murder. Now you're being dramatic again. Dramatic? The word exploded out of me with 26 years of frustration behind it. I'm dying, Melody. Do you understand that? My kidneys are failing. My nervous system is compromised. I've been walking around for weeks feeling like I'm losing my mind, while you sat there asking me about my symptoms like you cared. I do care. You care about watching me suffer. You care about being the good daughter who brings meals to her sick sister. You care about the performance. The truth hung between us like a blade. I could hear their breathing through the phone. Mom's quick and panicked. Dad's heavy with disbelief. Melody's controlled and measured. Vera, Dad said finally, these are very serious accusations. If you're wrong, if I'm wrong, then someone else has been systematically poisoning me while Melody coincidentally started a cooking hobby and began bringing me meals 3 times a week. If I'm wrong, then it's the most incredible series of coincidences in medical history. People do get sick sometimes, Mom said weakly, and sometimes the timing just seems suspicious even when it's not. Mom, stop. My voice was tired now, drained of anger, and left with something that felt like grief. Stop making excuses for her. Stop making this about my mental state or my stress levels or my imagination. I have been poisoned. Someone put antifreeze in my food. These are facts, not opinions. I heard whispering in the background, hushed and urgent. Probably Melody telling them what to say, how to handle this, what strategy would work best to make me doubt myself one more time. The police will be contacting you, I said. All of you. They'll want to know about Melody's access to my food, her cooking classes, her knowledge of my symptoms. They'll want to search her apartment, test her ingredients, analyze anything she's prepared recently. This is insane, Melody said, but her voice was tight now, the careful control fraying around the edges. You're destroying our family over some paranoid delusion. I'm not destroying anything. I'm revealing what was already broken. What's that supposed to mean?
It means that a family that immediately assumes their daughter is mentally ill when she reports being poisoned was never a healthy family to begin with. It means that parents who defend their child's potential murderer over their actual victim were never really protecting anyone. It means that this conversation is telling me everything I need to know about where I stand. The silence that followed was different from all the others. This wasn't shocked silence or calculating silence or even guilty silence. This was the silence of people realizing that the dynamics they'd relied on for decades were crumbling, and they didn't know how to rebuild without admitting their foundation had been rotten all along. "Vera," Mom said finally, her voice small and broken, "what do you want us to do?" It was such a simple question, but it hit me like a revelation. What did I want them to do? For 26 years, I'd wanted them to see me, to believe me, to choose me, just once over the easier narrative. Now I had proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, and they were still looking for escape routes. I want you to tell the truth when the police ask questions. I want you to stop making excuses, and I want you to understand that attempting to murder someone isn't a family matter to be handled quietly. It's a crime. "But she's your sister," Dad said, as if that changed the chemistry of antifreeze or the damage to my organs. "She's a person who tried to kill me. The fact that we share DNA doesn't make that less true." I could have said more. I could have detailed every holiday where Melody's achievements were celebrated while mine were barely acknowledged. Every family gathering where my concerns were dismissed as dramatic while her emotions were validated and soothed. I could have explained how years of being told I was too sensitive had trained me to doubt my own perceptions, making me the perfect victim for someone who understood exactly how to exploit those wounds. Instead, I said something that surprised even me. "I forgive you." What? "I forgive you for not believing me. I forgive you for choosing her story over mine before you even heard the facts. I forgive you for 26 years of teaching me that my reality didn't matter as much as keeping the peace." "Vera, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. I understand that you're going to keep making excuses because the alternative is admitting that you raised someone capable of attempted murder and then defended her when her victim asked for help. I understand that it's easier to believe I'm mentally ill than to believe your golden daughter is a criminal. And I understand that I can't change any of that." The words felt like letting go of a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. For the first time in weeks, my breathing felt clear. "I'm hanging up now. The police will be in touch." "Vera, wait." But I was already ending the call, already handing the phone back to Dr. Patterson, who'd been listening with growing concern. "Are you okay?" he asked.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I considered the question. My body was damaged, possibly permanently. My family had just revealed their true priorities. My sister had tried to kill me, and my parents were more concerned about protecting her than helping me. "No," I said honestly, "but I will be." The next few hours passed in a blur of official procedures, police interviews, evidence collection, formal statements. I gave them Melody's contact information, detailed the timeline of her lunch deliveries, described the progression of my symptoms. I handed over my phone so they could document the conversation I'd just had, providing them with what amounted to a confession wrapped in denial. Detective Morrison, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a patient manner, took careful notes as I spoke. "This level of planning suggests premeditation," she said when I finished. "Your sister would have had to research the effects, acquire the substances, determine dosing levels that would cause suffering without immediate death. This wasn't a crime of passion." The words hit harder than I expected. It was one thing to know I'd been poisoned. It was another to understand that my suffering had been carefully calculated, that someone had spent time planning exactly how to hurt me in the most devastating way possible. "Why antifreeze?" I asked. "It's accessible, relatively easy to disguise in food, and causes symptoms that can be mistaken for other conditions. Many people who are poisoned with ethylene glycol don't get diagnosed until it's too late because the initial symptoms mimic other illnesses." So I was supposed to die thinking I had cancer or kidney disease or something else entirely? Detective Morrison nodded grimly. If you hadn't been a medical professional, if you hadn't pushed for comprehensive testing, you probably would have. Your sister was counting on the medical community missing this. That evening, alone in my apartment for the first time in weeks, I sat with the reality of what had happened. My phone had been ringing constantly. My parents, other family members who'd heard whispers of police involvement, even a few colleagues who'd gotten word that something serious was happening. I ignored them all. Instead, I pulled out the textbooks I'd been too sick to study, the journals I'd been too exhausted to read. For the first time in weeks, my hands were steady enough to hold them without shaking. The nausea that had plagued me was finally starting to fade as my body began processing the poison out of my system. I read until nearly midnight, catching up on everything I'd missed while I was being slowly murdered by someone who smiled while she did it. Each page felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me, my focus, my energy, my future. The next morning brought news that would have surprised me a few days earlier, but felt inevitable now. Melody had been arrested at her apartment, where police found a collection of automotive supplies in her kitchen cabinet, including half-empty bottles of antifreeze. They also found a detailed journal documenting my symptoms, carefully tracking the progression of my illness with the clinical detachment of a researcher monitoring a lab experiment. The journal entries, Detective Morrison told me later, revealed a level of calculation that chilled even experienced investigators. Melody had documented not just my physical symptoms, but my emotional state, noting with satisfaction when I seemed confused or frightened, expressing frustration when my condition improved on days she hadn't been able to bring me food. March 15th, Morrison read from the journal. V seems more confused today, struggling to concentrate during conversation. Excellent progress. Need to increase frequency of doses to maintain momentum. March 22nd. V mentioned feeling dizzy during procedures. Good. Hospital stress should compound the effects and make medical staff assume it's work-related. March 28th. V is starting to look visibly ill. Others are noticing. Need to be more supportive and concerned in public to maintain my image as caring sister. The entries went on for weeks, a detailed record of my deterioration written by the person who was causing it. But what struck me most wasn't the cruelty, it was the complete absence of anything resembling guilt or hesitation. Melody had approached my murder like a project, complete with goals, timelines, and progress measurements. The family response was exactly what I'd expected, and everything I'd feared. Within hours of Melody's arrest, I received a call from my mother that I almost didn't answer. "Vera, you have to help her. She's your sister." Not, "How are you feeling?" or "Thank God you're alive," or even, "I'm sorry we didn't believe you." Just immediate advocacy for the person who'd tried to kill me. "She tried to murder me, Mom." "She's sick. She needs help, not jail time. You're a doctor. You understand mental illness better than anyone. This isn't who she really is." This is exactly who she really is. It just took attempted murder for you to see it. "Don't be cruel, Vera. We're all trying to process this. Nobody expected." I expected it. The words came out before I could stop them, carrying a truth I hadn't even admitted to myself until that moment. Maybe not poisoning specifically, but I expected her to hurt me eventually. She's been hurting me my whole life. This is just the first time there's been medical evidence. Mom was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more fragile than I'd ever heard it. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that someone who could smile while watching me deteriorate, who could ask about my symptoms while knowing she was causing them, who could plan my death like a grocery list, that person didn't become a monster overnight. You just chose not to see the monster that was always there." "That's not fair." "What's not fair is 26 years of being told I was too sensitive when I noticed her cruelty. What's not fair is being called paranoid when I pointed out her manipulations. What's not fair is being gaslit by my own family every time I tried to protect myself from someone who apparently wanted me dead." I could hear her crying on the other end of the line, and for the first time in my life, I felt no urge to comfort her. Her tears were for the daughter she was losing to prison, not for the daughter she'd nearly lost to murder. The lawyer says if you don't press charges, maybe we can get her into treatment instead of prison, she said finally. And there it was, the ask I'd been waiting for, the request that revealed everything about how my family saw the situation. Even now, even with physical evidence and a confession journal, they wanted me to prioritize Melody's well-being over my own justice. No. Please, Vera, think about what this will do to our family. Your family did this to me. I'm just making sure there are consequences.
She's not well. Prison won't help her. Prison will keep her from poisoning anyone else. Treatment centers can't do that for people who don't think they've done anything wrong. How can you be so cold? She's your sister. She was my sister when she put antifreeze in my food. She was my sister when she documented my suffering like a science experiment. She was my sister when she smiled and asked about my symptoms while knowing she was killing me. Being related to me didn't stop her from trying to murder me. Why should it stop me from seeking justice? The question hung between us like a challenge. For 26 years, family loyalty had been a one-way street in our house. I was expected to absorb Melody's cruelties in silence, to minimize her manipulations, to accept less so she could have more. Even now, facing attempted murder, the expectation was that I would sacrifice my need for justice to preserve her future. I won't do it, I said quietly. I won't pretend this didn't happen, and I won't let her escape consequences because it's uncomfortable for you to admit what she is. What if she gets 20 years? What if her life is ruined? What if I had died? What if I'd never figured out what was happening and just slowly deteriorated until my organs failed? Would you be asking Melody to consider my ruined life then? Silence, the kind of silence that admitted everything without saying a word. I have to go, I said. I have a meeting with the prosecutor. Vera, please. I love you, Mom, but I love myself too. And for the first time in my life, I'm choosing me. I hung up and turned off my phone. Outside my apartment window, the city continued its normal rhythm, people going about their lives without knowing how close I'd come to losing mine. I had survived something that was supposed to kill me, solved a mystery that was designed to remain hidden, and confronted a truth that my family would probably never accept. The meeting with the prosecutor, Sarah Chen, was scheduled for that afternoon. She was a sharp woman in her 30s who specialized in domestic violence cases, which apparently included attempted murder by family members. Cases like this are particularly challenging, she explained as we reviewed the evidence. Juries struggle with the idea that someone would poison their own sister. The family relationships make it easier for defense attorneys to argue mental illness or accident. It wasn't an accident, I said. The journal proves premeditation. The journal helps, but defense will argue it shows mental illness rather than criminal intent. They'll say your sister was having a psychotic break, that she wasn't responsible for her actions. What do you think? Sarah Chen looked at me directly, her expression serious and respectful in a way that felt foreign after weeks of family conversations. I think someone who can maintain a normal social facade while systematically poisoning their sister, who can document their victim's deterioration with clinical detachment, who can comfort that victim while knowing they're causing the suffering, I think that person understands exactly what they're doing and chooses to do it anyway. For the first time since this all began, I felt truly heard. Not dismissed, not minimized, not explained away, but heard. We're going to pursue this as attempted murder in the first degree, she continued. The planning, the documentation, the sustained nature of the poisoning all support premeditation. Your sister knew what she was doing, and she did it anyway. The trial was set for 6 months later, giving me time to recover physically while the legal system prepared to confront what my family couldn't. During those months, I threw myself back into my residency with a focus that surprised everyone, including myself. The symptoms that had been destroying my concentration and coordination disappeared as the poison worked its way out of my system. My hands became steady again, my mind clear, my energy returning in waves that reminded me how much I'd lost without realizing it. Dr. Martinez pulled me aside one afternoon as I was finishing a particularly complex procedure. "You're different," he said. "More focused, more confident. Whatever was affecting you before, I'm glad you figured it out. So am I."
The other residents have been asking what happened. The rumors range from everything from addiction recovery to a secret illness. I considered how much to share. The story was going to come out eventually, especially once the trial began and media attention followed. But for now, it felt good to be known simply as Vera, the resident who'd overcome some unnamed challenge and emerged stronger. Family issues, I said finally. They're resolved now. During those months, I received sporadic contact from various family members. Aunt Rebecca called to check on me, but spent most of the conversation advocating for Melody. Cousin James sent a carefully worded text suggesting that family therapy might be better than criminal prosecution. Even my grandmother, 83, and supposedly the family matriarch, left a voicemail explaining that families stick together and these things should be handled privately. Each contact reinforced the same message. My need for justice was less important than their comfort with the family narrative. Even faced with undeniable evidence, they wanted me to prioritize protecting Melody over protecting myself. I stopped responding to most of them. The energy I'd once spent defending my perceptions, explaining my feelings, and justifying my needs was redirected toward my patients, my studies, and my own healing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to convince anyone that my reality was valid. I simply lived it. The most surprising contact came from Melody herself. A letter from jail, handwritten on lined paper, arrived 3 months after her arrest. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won. "Dear Vera," it began, and I was struck immediately by how normal her handwriting looked. Neat, careful, the same script that had signed birthday cards and Christmas gifts for years. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand that I never meant for things to go this far. I was going through a difficult time, and I made some poor choices. I've been talking to a therapist here who says I was experiencing a dissociative episode brought on by stress and family pressure. I know you think I tried to hurt you on purpose, but that's not what happened. I was confused and acting out in ways that didn't make sense even to me. The journal they found was just me trying to understand what was happening to you, not evidence of planning. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me and maybe speak to the prosecutor about treatment instead of prison. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still your sister, and I think deep down you know I would never really want to hurt you. Love, Melody." I read the letter twice, then set it aside and returned to my medical journals. Everything about it was vintage Melody. The subtle blame shifting, the reframing of attempted murder as poor choices, the request for forgiveness without acknowledgement of specific harm, the appeal to family loyalty over personal justice.
But what struck me most was how little it affected me. 6 months earlier, a letter like this would have sent me spiraling, questioning my perceptions, wondering if I was being too harsh. Now, it read like a manipulation manual, so obvious in its tactics that it felt almost insulting. I never responded. There was nothing to say to someone who could document my suffering in clinical detail while claiming it was an unconscious act. Nothing to say to someone who characterized systematic poisoning as a poor choice. Nothing to say to someone who asked for forgiveness while denying the very actions that required forgiving. The trial began on a Tuesday in November. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, filled with family members I hadn't seen in months, reporters drawn by the unusual nature of the case, and medical professionals who'd been called as witnesses. I sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to my residency interviews years earlier. Melody sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the sister I'd known. Gone were the carefully styled hair and trendy clothes that had always been part of her presentation. Instead, she wore a simple gray dress, minimal makeup, and an expression of confused sadness that I recognized as performance but probably looked genuine to observers who didn't know her. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the medical evidence first, my blood work, the progression of my symptoms, expert testimony about ethylene glycol poisoning and its effects. Dr. Patterson took the stand to explain how the levels in my system indicated repeated exposure over weeks, how the symptoms I'd experienced were consistent with deliberate poisoning. Then came the evidence from Melody's apartment, the antifreeze bottles, the journal, the detailed recipes she'd been using to disguise the taste. The prosecutor read selected entries from the journal, each one more damning than the last.
Subject appears increasingly disoriented. Perfect. Need to maintain appearance of sisterly concern while increasing frequency. Symptoms are progressing exactly as researched. V is beginning to suspect something but doesn't know what. Her medical training might become a problem. Need to be more careful about timing. V mentioned feeling dizzy during surgery today. Excellent progress. One more incident like that, and they might suspend her from clinical duties. That would be ideal. Each entry was read in Sarah Chen's clear, professional voice, but I could hear Melody's tone behind the words: clinical, satisfied, calculating. The courtroom was dead silent as the full scope of her planning became clear. The defense strategy was exactly what the prosecutor had predicted. Melody's lawyer painted her as a young woman overwhelmed by family pressure, struggling with mental health issues, acting out of character due to psychological stress. They brought in expert witnesses to discuss dissociative disorders, the effects of family dysfunction on psychological development, the possibility that Melody had been experiencing a break from reality. When Melody took the stand in her own defense, she was everything I'd expected. Tearful but controlled, confused but articulate, remorseful but vague about what exactly she was sorry for. "I love my sister," she said, looking directly at the jury. "I would never want to hurt her. I was going through a very difficult time personally, and I think I was acting out in ways that didn't make sense even to me." "Can you explain the journal entries?" her lawyer asked. "I was trying to understand what was happening to Vera. She was getting so sick, and I was worried about her. I think I was documenting her symptoms because I thought it might help doctors figure out what was wrong." "And the antifreeze found in your apartment?" "I had been having car problems. I bought it for my car and forgot I had it. I never connected it to anything that was happening with my sister." It was masterfully done. Every answer technically addressed the question while avoiding responsibility. Every explanation sounded plausible if you didn't look too closely at the timeline or the level of detail in her documentation. But when the prosecutor cross-examined her, the performance began to crack. "Ms. Walsh, you documented that your sister appears increasingly disoriented and called this perfect. Can you explain what you meant?" I I think I was just relieved that doctors might finally figure out what was wrong with her." "You wrote that her symptoms were progressing exactly as researched. What research were you referring to?" "I don't remember writing that." "But this is your handwriting, correct?" "Yes, but I was in a very confused state at the time." "Confused enough to maintain detailed documentation over several weeks, but too confused to remember what you wrote?" The contradictions piled up as Sarah Chen methodically dismantled Melody's explanations. How could someone be too mentally ill to understand their actions, but organized enough to maintain a detailed journal? How could someone accidentally purchase antifreeze and forget about it, while coincidentally documenting symptoms that matched antifreeze poisoning? How could someone be documenting symptoms to help medical professionals while never sharing those observations with any medical professionals? When my turn came to testify, I felt strangely calm. I'd spent months preparing for this moment, but also years learning to trust my own perceptions, despite family pressure to doubt them. I walked through the timeline: Melody's sudden interest in cooking, the lunch deliveries that coincided with my symptoms, the way she'd watch me eat and ask detailed questions about how I was feeling. I described the progression of my illness, the way it affected my work, the fear of not knowing what was happening to my body. "At what point did you suspect your sister might be involved?" Sarah Chen asked. "When she suggested I might be having a mental breakdown. When faced with evidence that I was being poisoned, her immediate response wasn't concern or shock. It was to suggest that I was psychiatrically unstable. That's when I realized someone who truly cared about me would want to find out who was poisoning me, not convince me I was imagining it." "How did your family respond when you told them about the poisoning?" "They defended her before hearing the evidence. They asked me not to press charges before understanding what had happened. They prioritized protecting her reputation over my safety." The defense attorney tried to shake my testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that my medical training had made me paranoid, that the stress of residency had affected my judgment, that family dysfunction might have led me to misinterpret innocent actions. But 6 months of recovery had given me something I'd never had before: unshakable confidence in my own perceptions. I'd been proven right about the poisoning. I'd been proven right about the deliberate nature of it. I'd been proven right about my family's priorities. I was no longer willing to doubt myself to make others comfortable. "Dr. Walsh, Isn't it possible that your sister was genuinely trying to help you and that the timing was simply coincidental?
No, I said simply. Someone who wants to help doesn't document their victim's suffering with satisfaction. Someone who wants to help doesn't research the effects of poison and then track how well it's working. Someone who wants to help doesn't suggest their victim is mentally ill when the victim discovers they're being poisoned. The trial lasted 2 weeks. During deliberation, I waited in my apartment, avoiding news coverage and family contact. I'd done everything I could to seek justice. The outcome was no longer in my control. The jury reached a verdict in 3 days. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder in the first degree, assault with a deadly weapon, and criminal endangerment. I was in the courthouse when the verdict was read, sitting in the same front row where I'd spent 2 weeks learning the legal definition of what had been done to me. When the foreman announced guilty, I felt something I hadn't expected, not relief or satisfaction, but a deep, quiet peace. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about validation. For the first time in my life, an objective authority had listened to my account of being hurt and decided that I was telling the truth, that what happened to me mattered, that the person who hurt me should face consequences. Melody showed no reaction to the verdict, beyond a slight tightening around her eyes. Even in defeat, she maintained perfect control, the same composure she'd shown while poisoning me. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. I wasn't required to attend, but I chose to be there for the victim impact statement I'd been invited to give. Standing at the podium in that same courtroom, facing the judge who would determine my sister's fate, I spoke directly to the woman who'd tried to kill me. Melody, you spent weeks documenting my suffering while pretending to care about me. You calculated dosages designed to cause maximum pain without immediate death. You turned my need for family connection into a weapon against me. But what you couldn't calculate was this. Every day you made me weaker in body, you made me stronger in spirit. Every time you asked about my symptoms while knowing you caused them, you taught me the difference between real concern and performance. Every time our family chose to believe your lies over my truth, you showed me exactly who I could count on. You tried to kill me, but you ended up freeing me. You tried to destroy my future, but you gave me clarity about my past. You tried to break me, but you broke the illusions I'd been carrying about family loyalty and unconditional love. So thank you. Not for the poisoning. That was evil and criminal and caused damage that will take years to fully heal. But thank you for showing me exactly who you are, who our family is, and who I need to be to protect myself. I don't forgive you. I don't feel sorry for you. And I don't want you to ever contact me again. But I do want you to know that you failed. You didn't destroy me. You revealed me. Melody received 22 years in prison. The judge cited the premeditation, the extended timeline, and the complete lack of remorse in her sentencing. She'll be eligible for parole in 15 years, by which time I'll be a fully qualified pediatric surgeon with a life she had no part in building. After the sentencing, my parents approached me in the courthouse hallway. They looked older than I remembered, worn down by months of media attention and social scrutiny. "Vera," my mother said, her voice tentative, "can we talk, maybe grab coffee?" I looked at them both, these people who'd raised me, who'd shaped my understanding of love and loyalty, who taught me to doubt myself at every turn. They looked smaller now, diminished by the reality of what their golden child had done and their role in enabling it. "No," I said gently, "I don't think that would be good for me." "We're still your parents," Dad said. "We love you." "I know you think you do, but love doesn't look like what you've shown me. Love doesn't ask the victim to protect their attacker. Love doesn't dismiss evidence to preserve comfort. Love doesn't choose sides between attempted murder and justice." "We made mistakes," Mom admitted, "but we're family. That has to count for something." "It does count. It counts as the reason I know exactly what to expect from you the next time someone hurts me. It counts as the reason I'll never trust you with my safety again. It counts as the reason I'm building a life that doesn't depend on your approval or support." They wanted to argue. I could see it in their faces.
The impulse to defend themselves, to explain their choices, to make me understand why they'd acted as they did. But something in my expression must have told them it was pointless. "Will we ever see you again?" Mom asked, and she sounded genuinely lost. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Right now, I need space to heal from what was done to me and from how you responded to it. Maybe someday we can have a relationship that's based on who we actually are instead of who you've wanted me to be. But that would require you to see me clearly, and I'm not sure you're capable of that." I walked away from them in that courthouse hallway, leaving behind 26 years of trying to earn love from people who taught me that my needs came second to their comfort. It should have felt like abandonment, but instead, it felt like coming home to myself. 6 months later, I successfully completed my pediatric surgery residency and matched for a fellowship at Johns Hopkins. The attending physician who wrote my recommendation letter mentioned my resilience in the face of personal challenges, my renewed focus and confidence, and my obvious dedication to healing others. I didn't tell her about the poisoning or the trial. I didn't need to explain what I'd survived to prove what I was capable of. My work spoke for itself, my results demonstrated my abilities, and my future stretched ahead of me, unmarked by anyone else's attempt to define or destroy it. Sometimes people ask if I regret pressing charges, if I miss my family, if I think 22 years was too harsh a sentence for someone who was clearly disturbed. The questions always carry an assumption that forgiveness and family reconciliation should be my goals, that holding on to anger or pursuing justice is somehow beneath me as a healer. But I've learned that the kindest thing you can do for someone who hurts you is to let them face the natural consequences of their actions. Melody needed to learn that other people aren't toys to be manipulated, that attempting murder has serious ramifications, that mental health struggles don't excuse criminal behavior. Prison might be the first place she's ever been held truly accountable for her choices. And I needed to learn that my safety and well-being matter enough to fight for, even when fighting means disappointing people I love. I needed to discover that I could trust my own perceptions, seek my own justice, and build my own life without permission from anyone else. The little girl who won that science fair so many years ago, standing alone with her ribbon and her smile, she knew something I'd forgotten along the way. She knew that her accomplishments belonged to her, that her joy didn't require an audience, that her worth wasn't determined by other people's ability to see it. It took 26 years and a near-death experience to remember what she knew instinctively. Sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to stop waiting for applause and start celebrating your own victories.
Today, I save children's lives for a living. I repair hearts and remove tumors and give families hope they thought they'd lost. I do work that matters in a way that's measurable and clear. And when I go home at night to my quiet apartment with my medical journals and my career plans and my peaceful solitude, I remember that the most important life I ever saved was my own. Not from the poison that nearly killed me, but from the family dynamics that convinced me I didn't deserve to live safely, happily, and entirely on my own terms. The blood work proved everything about the poisoning, but surviving it proved everything about me. 2 years after the trial, I was deep in my fellowship at Johns Hopkins when I received a phone call that changed everything again. It was Dr. Patricia Henley, the chief of pediatric surgery, and her voice carried an unusual tension. "Vera, I need you in my office immediately. There's been a development in a case that involves you personally." My blood ran cold. After everything I'd been through, the word development still triggered a fight-or-flight response that I'd learned to manage but never fully eliminated. I walked through the hospital corridors that had become my second home, past the NICU where I'd spent countless hours perfecting microsurgical techniques, past the conference rooms where I'd presented cases that were reshaping pediatric surgical protocols. Dr. Henley's office overlooked the Baltimore Harbor, and on any other day, I would have paused to appreciate the view. Today, I noticed only her grave expression and the manila folder sitting on her desk like an accusation. "Sit down, Vera. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear." I sat, my hands steady in a way they hadn't been 2 years ago, my breathing controlled despite the anxiety creeping up my spine. Whatever this was, I would face it with the strength I'd earned through survival. We received a call from the Maryland State Police this morning. There's been another poisoning case, and the circumstances are remarkably similar to what happened to you. The victim is a young medical professional, the perpetrator is a family member, and the methods are nearly identical. The words hit me like a physical blow. Someone else was living through the nightmare I'd survived. Someone else was being systematically destroyed by someone they trusted. The detective handling the case contacted us because your case file flagged in their system when they ran the toxicology patterns. They want to speak with you about possible connections. Connections? The victim's sister had been in correspondence with your sister while she was awaiting trial. Apparently, they met in a support group for families of incarcerated individuals, and there's evidence that detailed information about methods and timing was shared. My mind reeled. Melody had taught someone else how to poison their family member. While sitting in jail awaiting trial for attempting to murder me, she had found another person with similar inclinations and provided them with a tutorial on systematic poisoning. Who's the victim? Dr. Rachel Morrison, a surgery resident at University of Maryland, 28 years old, identical symptoms to what you experienced, same substance, same progressive timeline. The only difference is that her family believed her when she said something was wrong, so they caught it earlier. I closed my eyes, imagining another young doctor sitting in a hospital room, receiving test results that confirmed their worst fears, facing the reality that someone they loved had been trying to kill them. But this time, the family had listened. This time, the victim had support instead of gaslighting. Is she alive? She's alive and recovering. The organ damage is less severe than what you experienced because of early intervention. But Vera, there's more. The sister who poisoned her had detailed notes about your case, including information that was never made public. Information that could only have come from someone with direct knowledge of Melody's methods. The implications crashed over me like a wave. Melody hadn't just tried to murder me, she'd turned her methods into a reproducible system that others could follow. She'd taken her attempt on my life and weaponized it into something that could destroy other families, other victims, other young professionals who'd trusted the wrong person. What do the police need from me? They want to interview you about any contact you might have had with Melody since the trial, any knowledge of her connections with other inmates or outside contacts, anything that might help them understand how the information was transmitted. I hadn't spoken to Melody since the trial. I'd blocked every attempt at contact, refused every letter, declined every request for visits or phone calls. But apparently, my silence hadn't stopped her from continuing to cause harm. There's something else, Dr. Henley continued, her voice gentler now. The media has gotten hold of the story. The fact that two medical professionals were poisoned by sisters using nearly identical methods, and that your case was used as a blueprint for another attempted murder, it's going to be national news. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with unwanted attention, with having my private trauma turned into public spectacle. I'd worked so hard to build a life where I was known for my surgical skills rather than my survival story, where my identity wasn't defined by what had been done to me. Dr. Morrison specifically asked to speak with you. She said knowing that someone else had survived something similar and gone on to have a successful career was the only thing keeping her grounded right now. That changed everything. This wasn't just about media attention or police investigations. It was about another survivor who needed to know that healing was possible, that life could continue after family betrayal, that strength could be built from the ruins of trust. Set up the meeting. The next day, I drove to University of Maryland Medical Center for the first time since my own poisoning ordeal. Walking through hospital corridors that looked so similar to the ones where I'd struggled through my residency while being slowly murdered brought back memories I'd carefully filed away. But this time, I wasn't the confused, sick resident questioning her own reality. I was Dr. Vera Walsh, pediatric surgical fellow, survivor, and someone who could offer hope to another victim. Rachel Morrison was sitting in a patient room that could have been mine 2 years earlier. She had the same pale, drawn look I'd seen in mirrors during my worst days, the same hollow-eyed exhaustion that came from systemic poisoning combined with the emotional trauma of family betrayal. But when she saw me, her face lit up with something I recognized, the desperate hope of someone who'd been told they were crazy, finding validation in another person's experience.
Dr. Walsh, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Thank you for coming. I know this must be difficult for you. I sat in the chair beside her bed, the same position where family members had once pretended to care about my welfare while plotting my destruction. But this conversation would be different. This would be about truth, about healing, about one survivor helping another navigate the impossible terrain of recovery. Tell me what happened. Rachel's story unfolded with horrifying familiarity. Her sister Amanda had always been the favored child, the one who could do no wrong, while Rachel was criticized for being too serious, too focused on her career, too independent. When Rachel started her surgery residency, Amanda had suddenly become interested in cooking, bringing elaborate meals to the hospital and insisting that Rachel needed better nutrition to handle the stress.
The symptoms started slowly, Rachel said, her hands shaking as she spoke. Nausea, dizziness, fatigue that felt different from normal residency exhaustion. But when I mentioned it to my family, they actually listened. My mom insisted I get tested, my dad drove me to appointments, and when the results came back showing poison, they immediately believed me. The difference in family response was stark and telling. Where my family had defended my attacker, Rachel's family had defended her. Where mine had sought to minimize and explain away the evidence, hers had demanded justice and accountability. Amanda had a notebook, Rachel continued, detailed instructions about dosing, timing, symptom progression, even strategies for maintaining a caring facade while administering poison. The police said it read like a manual, and some of the language was identical to journal entries from another case. Your case. Have you seen her since the arrest? Once. She asked to speak with me before her hearing, said she had important information that might help with sentencing. I agreed because I thought maybe she was finally going to explain why she did it, maybe apologize or show some recognition of the harm she'd caused. Rachel paused, her jaw tightening with anger that I recognized intimately. Instead, she spent 20 minutes explaining how your sister had shared strategies for maintaining family sympathy during prosecution, how to present as mentally ill rather than malicious, how to frame the poisoning as a cry for help rather than attempted murder, how to make the family feel sorry for the perpetrator instead of supporting the victim. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Even from prison, Melody was still teaching others how to destroy their families, still spreading the techniques she'd perfected on me, still finding ways to cause maximum harm while maintaining plausible deniability. Did Amanda express any remorse? Rachel laughed bitterly. She said she was sorry I'd taken it so personally, sorry that I couldn't understand that she was trying to help me realize I wasn't cut out for surgery. Sorry that I was being dramatic about what she called a few digestive issues. The familiar language of deflection and blame shifting that I'd heard in my own family's responses. Amanda had learned not just Melody's poisoning techniques, but her psychological manipulation strategies as well. What's your family's response been? Complete support. My parents hired the best lawyers they could afford. My brother took leave from work to be with me during the worst of it. My extended family has rallied around me in ways I never expected. They're all horrified by what Amanda did, and none of them are making excuses for her. I felt a complex mix of emotions. Happiness that Rachel had the support I'd been denied, but also a sharp pain, recognizing what I'd been deprived of. Her family's reaction highlighted just how abnormal my own family's response had been, how their immediate defense of Melody over me had been a choice rather than an inevitable family dynamic. How are you processing the family aspect? It's complicated. Amanda and I were never close, but I never thought she hated me enough to try to kill me. Learning that she spent months planning my suffering, documenting my decline, perfecting her methods based on research she'd done about your case, it's made me question everything I thought I knew about my family dynamics. Rachel's voice broke slightly, and I saw in her face the same disorientation I'd felt when my worldview had shattered along with my trust in the people who were supposed to protect me. The hardest part, she continued, is understanding that she did this not out of passion or temporary mental illness, but as a long-term project. She studied your case like a textbook, adapted the methods to fit our family situation, and executed a plan designed to destroy my career and possibly my life.
That level of calculation is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. I reached for her hand, offering the comfort I'd never received during my own darkest moments. The calculation is the hardest part to accept because it forces you to see the person who hurt you as they really are, not as you hoped they might be. When someone poisons you in a moment of rage, you can tell yourself it was aberrant behavior. When someone spends months planning your suffering, studying techniques from other cases, and documenting your decline with satisfaction, that's who they are at their core. How do you live with that knowledge? It was the question I'd been asking myself for 2 years, the one that still surfaced during quiet moments when I wasn't distracted by work or progress or the demands of daily life. You live with it by understanding that their choices reflect their character, not your worth. You live with it by building a life that doesn't require their participation or approval. You live with it by focusing on what you can control: your healing, your career, your relationships with people who've proven they can be trusted. Do you ever regret pursuing prosecution? Do you ever wish you'd just cut contact and moved on? Never. Prosecution was about more than punishment. It was about establishing truth in an objective forum. It was about having someone with authority listen to what happened and declare that it mattered, that I mattered, that what was done to me was criminal rather than acceptable family drama. Rachel nodded, understanding immediately what I meant. My family keeps asking if I'm sure I want to press charges, not because they don't believe me, but because they're worried about the stress of a trial, the media attention, the impact on my career. They mean well, but they don't understand that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about validation. Exactly. And it's about preventing future victims. If Amanda faces real consequences, maybe the next person considering similar actions will think twice. If she doesn't, you've essentially given her permission to try again with someone else. We talked for 2 more hours, covering everything from the physical effects of chronic poisoning to the psychological impact of family betrayal to the practical aspects of navigating a criminal trial while maintaining a medical career. By the time I left, Rachel looked more grounded, more determined, more confident in her decision to seek justice. But the conversation had stirred up emotions I thought I'd processed. Driving back to Baltimore, I found myself thinking about Melody for the first time in months, wondering what other harm she might be causing from her prison cell, what other families she might be teaching to destroy themselves from the inside. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since the trial. I called Detective Morrison, the woman who'd handled my case. "Dr. Walsh, I was wondering if you'd call. I assume you've heard about the Morrison case." "I have. I met with the victim today." "Detective Morrison, I need to know what else Melody has been involved in. This can't be the only case where her methods were shared." "We're investigating that now. Your sister has been corresponding with multiple individuals, some of whom have family members in medical or high-stress professions. The patterns are concerning." "What patterns?" "Letters discussing family accountability, sharing detailed information about your case, offering advice on helping family members recognize their limitations. She's essentially running a consulting service for family members who want to sabotage their relatives." The scope of it was breathtaking. Melody wasn't just a person who'd tried to murder her sister. She was actively teaching others to commit similar crimes, turning her failed attempt on my life into a blueprint for destroying other families. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Actually, yes. We're building a case for additional charges related to conspiracy and accessory to attempted murder. If you'd be willing to testify about the original case and any subsequent contact attempts, it would strengthen our position significantly." "She'll be facing additional time?" "If we can prove she was actively facilitating other poisoning attempts, she could receive consecutive sentences for each case."
We're talking about potentially life in prison rather than just the 22 years she's currently serving. I thought about Rachel, lying in that hospital bed, processing the betrayal of someone she'd trusted. I thought about other potential victims, other young professionals who might be targeted by family members armed with Melody's techniques. I thought about the journal entries where she documented my suffering with clinical satisfaction, and how that same callousness was now being shared with others. I'll testify. The next few months brought a media storm unlike anything I'd experienced during my original case. The story of connected poisoning cases, of one perpetrator teaching others to commit similar crimes, captured national attention in ways that made my private trauma into public spectacle.
But this time, I wasn't alone in the spotlight. Rachel Morrison went public with her story, speaking eloquently about family betrayal, about the importance of believing victims, about the need for serious consequences when trust is weaponized. Together, we became symbols of something larger than our individual cases. We represented the reality that abuse could happen in any family, that education and professional success offered no protection against those determined to cause harm. The additional trial was scheduled for 8 months later. During that time, police identified 4 more cases where Melody's correspondence had preceded suspicious illnesses in family members. 3 involved medical professionals, 1 involved a law student, and all showed the same patterns of systematic poisoning combined with family gaslighting that had characterized both my case and Rachel's. Not all of the victims survived. Dr. Jennifer Chen, a resident in Oregon, had died from organ failure before anyone realized she was being poisoned. Her sister had been following Melody's instructions for higher doses over shorter periods, apparently impatient with the gradual decline that Melody had recommended. By the time Jennifer's symptoms were severe enough to demand immediate medical attention, the damage was irreversible. Learning about Jennifer's death changed everything for me. This wasn't just about multiple attempted murders, it was about actual murder, about a young doctor whose life had been ended by someone using techniques my sister had taught them. Melody's legacy now included not just my suffering, but another woman's death. I attended Jennifer's memorial service, held at the Oregon Medical School where she'd been training to become a pediatric oncologist. Her parents spoke about her dedication to helping children with cancer, her plans to work in underserved communities, her dream of opening a free clinic for families who couldn't afford specialized care. All of that potential, all of those lives she might have saved, ended because someone had followed Melody's instructions for turning family meals into weapons. Jennifer's sister, Patricia, had been arrested and charged with murder. During her interrogation, she'd provided police with copies of extensive correspondence with Melody, including detailed instructions for accelerating the poisoning process and strategies for maintaining innocence if the victim died. "Your sister told me that if I increase the doses, I could make it look like a sudden medical crisis rather than gradual illness," Patricia had told investigators. She said rapid organ failure was harder to trace and that medical professionals often miss poisoning in their own colleagues because they assumed professional competence meant personal safety. The calculated nature of the advice was staggering. Melody hadn't just been sharing techniques, she'd been optimizing them, helping other perpetrators avoid the mistakes that had led to her own capture. She'd turned attempted murder into a systematic methodology that could be taught, learned, and improved upon. When the additional trial began, I was the prosecution's first witness. Walking into that courtroom again, seeing Melody at the defense table with the same controlled composure she'd maintained throughout her original trial, I felt an anger I hadn't experienced since the day I'd received my toxicology results. But this time, the anger was clean and focused. It wasn't about personal betrayal or family dynamics. It was about justice for victims who'd never had the chance to confront their attackers, about preventing future tragedies, about holding someone accountable for the full scope of harm they'd caused. Sarah Chen was prosecuting this case as well, and her opening statement laid out the extensive evidence of Melody's continued criminal activity from her prison cell. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about more than one person's attempt to murder her sister. This is about a woman who turned her crime into a teaching tool, who used her time in prison to perfect her methods and share them with others, who bears responsibility not just for her own victim, but for every person who was harmed using techniques she provided." The evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of letters between Melody and multiple correspondents, detailed instructions for acquiring and administering various poisons, advice on maintaining innocence while causing maximum harm, and even testimonials from Melody about the satisfaction she derived from my suffering. One letter, addressed to Patricia Chen, contained language that made my blood run cold. "The key is patience and documentation. Watch them suffer slowly. The deterioration is almost as satisfying as the final outcome, and if done correctly, you'll never be suspected." Another, sent to Amanda Morrison, included specific advice about hospital protocols. Medical professionals are trained to help others, but often ignore their own symptoms. They'll attribute their suffering to work stress until it's too late to save themselves. Use their dedication against them. When I took the stand, I testified not just about my own experience, but about the impact of learning that my suffering had been used as a blueprint for harming others. I spoke about Jennifer Chen, about the dreams that had died with her, about the children who would never receive the care she planned to provide. Dr. Walsh, Sarah Chen asked, how has learning about these additional cases affected your own healing process? It's made me understand that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident of family dysfunction. It was the first iteration of a systematic approach to destroying people's lives. Knowing that my sister used what she did to me as a teaching tool for others has reframed my entire understanding of who she is and what she's capable of. Do you believe your sister bears responsibility for the harm caused to other victims? Absolutely. Someone who provides detailed instructions for committing murder, who coaches others on avoiding detection, who celebrates the suffering of victims, that person is responsible for every crime committed using their methods. The defense attempted the same strategy they'd used in Melody's original trial. Claims of mental illness, suggestions that she was confused about the nature of her correspondence, arguments that her letters had been misinterpreted by unstable individuals looking for someone to blame for their own actions. But this time, the evidence was too extensive and too specific for those arguments to carry weight. The jury saw through her performance to the calculating intelligence that had enabled her to commit attempted murder, and then teach others to do the same. When Melody took the stand in her own defense, I watched her with the clinical detachment I'd learned to apply to difficult cases. She was still beautiful, still articulate, still capable of projecting innocence and confusion when it served her purposes. But I could see the intelligence behind her performance, the careful calculation that went into every word choice and facial expression. Miss Walsh, her attorney asked, can you explain the nature of your correspondence with these individuals? I was trying to help people understand family dynamics that might be contributing to medical symptoms in their relatives. Sometimes stress and family pressure can manifest as physical illness, and I was sharing my observations about that. Did you ever encourage anyone to harm another person? Never. I was sharing my thoughts about how family stress can affect health, not recommending that anyone take any specific actions. It was masterfully done. Every answer technically addressed the question while avoiding admission of criminal intent. But when Sarah Chen cross-examined her, the careful construction of her responses began to unravel. Miss Walsh, you wrote to Patricia Chen that rapid organ failure is harder to trace. Can you explain what you meant by that? I was discussing how sudden medical crises can be difficult for doctors to diagnose quickly. You also wrote that medical professionals often miss poisoning in their own colleagues. Why would you share that observation with someone whose sister was a medical professional? I was just sharing general information about diagnostic challenges. You advised Patricia to increase the doses for faster results. Doses of what? I don't recall writing that specific phrase. But this is your handwriting, correct? Yes, but I may have been discussing medication dosages for legitimate medical conditions. The contradictions piled up as Sarah methodically demonstrated that Melody's letters contained information that could only be relevant to someone planning to poison another person. There was no innocent explanation for detailed instructions about acquiring untraceable substances, no legitimate reason to coach someone on maintaining innocence while causing harm, no benign interpretation of celebrating another person's suffering. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to attempted murder in multiple cases, and first-degree murder in Jennifer Chen's death. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. This time, multiple victims and family members provided impact statements, creating a comprehensive picture of the harm Melody had caused both directly and indirectly.
Rachel Morrison spoke about the ongoing physical and psychological effects of poisoning, about the trust issues that made it difficult to accept food from anyone, about the hypervigilance that accompanied every meal and social interaction. Jennifer Chen's parents spoke about their daughter's unrealized potential, about the children who would never receive her care, about the hole in their family that could never be filled. I spoke last, addressing not just what Melody had done to me, but what she'd chosen to do with that experience afterward. Your Honor, my sister didn't just try to murder me. She turned that attempt into a teaching tool for others. She took the techniques she'd used to cause my suffering and shared them with people who went on to destroy other families. She bears responsibility not just for her actions against me, but for every victim who was harmed using methods she provided. Jennifer Chen died because my sister taught someone else how to optimize their poisoning techniques. Rachel Morrison nearly died because my sister shared detailed instructions on maintaining innocence while administering poison. At least 3 other people suffered organ damage because my sister turned attempted murder into a systematic methodology. This isn't about revenge or family dysfunction. This is about holding someone accountable for the full scope of harm they've caused and preventing future victims. My sister has shown no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing, and no intention of stopping her harmful activities. She represents an ongoing danger to anyone who trusts the wrong person with access to their food or drink. The judge sentenced Melody to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The consecutive sentences for multiple counts of conspiracy and accessory to murder, combined with her original attempted murder conviction, meant she would never be released. As the sentence was read, I watched Melody's face for any sign of emotion, any recognition of the gravity of what had been determined. But she maintained the same controlled composure she'd shown throughout both trials, the same calculated presentation that had characterized every interaction we'd ever had. After the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse with Rachel Morrison and members of Jennifer Chen's family, processing the end of a legal journey that had consumed nearly 3 years of our lives. Justice had been served, consequences had been imposed, and a dangerous person had been permanently removed from society. But the healing was far from complete. The physical effects of chronic poisoning would affect me for years, possibly permanently. The psychological impact of family betrayal required ongoing therapy and careful attention to relationship patterns. The knowledge that someone I'd trusted had tried to murder me, then taught others to commit similar crimes, was something I'd carry forever. Yet, standing there in the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by other survivors and supportive family members, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in my own perceptions, and absolute certainty that I'd made the right choices throughout this ordeal. I'd trusted my instincts when something felt wrong. I'd sought medical help when my symptoms persisted. I'd believed the evidence even when family members urged me to doubt it. I'd pursued justice even when loved ones asked me to prioritize their comfort over my safety. I'd testified against my sister, even when it meant reliving trauma publicly. And I'd continued fighting for accountability even when new victims emerged and the scope of harm expanded beyond anything I'd imagined. Every choice had been difficult. Every step had required courage I wasn't sure I possessed. But every decision had led to this moment: justice for multiple victims, prevention of future harm, and the knowledge that speaking truth had protected other people from suffering similar betrayals. 6 months later, I completed my fellowship at Johns Hopkins and accepted a position as attending pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. The hiring committee mentioned my research on family dynamics in medical settings, work that had grown directly out of my experiences with systematic abuse disguised as care. My first day as an attending physician, I stood in the same type of hospital corridor where I'd once struggled to maintain consciousness while being slowly poisoned. But this time, I was there as Dr. Vera Walsh, specialist in complex pediatric cardiac surgery, researcher in family trauma and medical abuse, survivor who'd turned her experience into expertise that could protect other vulnerable patients. The work was demanding in ways that felt completely different from the exhaustion I'd experienced during residency. This was the tiredness that came from saving lives, from performing procedures that gave children decades of healthy living ahead of them, from mentoring residents who reminded me of my younger self before trauma had taught me to question every meal and every gesture of care. During my second month, I encountered a case that brought everything full circle. A 12-year-old girl named Emma had been admitted with symptoms that reminded me uncomfortably of my own experience: progressive weakness, unexplained nausea, organ function decline that didn't match any known pediatric conditions.
The family dynamics were also familiar. Emma's older sister Sarah was particularly attentive, bringing homemade snacks and staying during visiting hours to ensure Emma ate everything she'd prepared. The parents praised Sarah's dedication while expressing frustration with Emma's picky eating and dramatic complaints about feeling sick. During my examination of Emma, I noticed small details that might have been missed by someone without my particular experience. The way she hesitated before eating anything Sarah brought. The way she watched her sister's face while chewing, as if looking for approval or reaction. The way she seemed more comfortable when Sarah wasn't in the room. "Emma," I said gently, sitting beside her bed after her family had left for dinner, "I want you to know that you can tell me anything about how you're feeling, including things that might seem scary or confusing." She looked at me with eyes that held more wariness than any 12-year-old should possess. "Dr. Walsh, sometimes I think Sarah puts things in my food. But that's crazy, right? She loves me. She's always taking care of me." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Here was another victim, another child being systematically harmed by someone who claimed to love her. Another family dynamic where the perpetrator was celebrated while the victim was dismissed. "Emma, it's not crazy to notice patterns or to trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Can you tell me more about what you've observed?" Over the next hour, Emma described months of progressive illness that coincided perfectly with Sarah's increased involvement in her meals. She talked about feeling sicker after eating things Sarah prepared, about Sarah's detailed questions about her symptoms, about the way Sarah seemed almost excited when Emma had to miss school or couldn't participate in activities she enjoyed. "My parents think I'm being paranoid," Emma said, using the same word that had been weaponized against me. "They say Sarah is just worried about me and trying to help. But something feels wrong." I ordered comprehensive toxicology screening for Emma, the same tests that had revealed the truth about my own poisoning. While we waited for results, I sat with her parents and explained why their daughter's instincts should be taken seriously rather than dismissed. "Dr. Walsh," Emma's mother said, "Sarah has been nothing but supportive during Emma's illness. She's the one who suggested we bring Emma to the hospital when she got worse. She's been preparing all of Emma's meals to ensure proper nutrition. The idea that she would hurt her own sister is unthinkable." I heard my own mother's voice in her words, the same defensive certainty, the same inability to consider that the helpful family member might be the source of harm rather than healing. "Mrs. Peterson, I understand this is difficult to consider, but Emma's symptoms, combined with her observations about feeling worse after eating food prepared by her sister, warrant investigation. If toxicology comes back negative, we'll explore other causes, but if it comes back positive, you'll want to know that information." The results arrived 2 days later. Elevated levels of household cleaning products in Emma's bloodstream, specifically substances that would cause gradual organ damage while being difficult to detect without specific testing. Sarah Peterson, age 16, had been poisoning her 12-year-old sister using techniques she'd researched online, including methods that had been detailed in media coverage of cases connected to Melody's teaching. She'd been documenting Emma's decline in a notebook hidden in her bedroom, tracking symptoms and adjusting dosages with the same clinical detachment that had characterized my sister's approach. Unlike my family's response, Emma's parents immediately believed the evidence and prioritized their daughter's safety. Sarah was arrested, Emma was removed from her care, and the family entered therapy to understand how they'd missed the signs of systematic abuse happening in their own home. Emma recovered fully, her organ function returning to normal once the poisoning stopped. But more importantly, she learned that her instincts had been correct, that speaking up about uncomfortable truths was brave rather than dramatic, that adults could listen to her concerns and act to protect her rather than dismiss her fears. Working on Emma's case crystallized something I'd been processing since my own experience, the importance of believing victims, especially when their accounts challenge comfortable family narratives.
How many children like Emma were being harmed by siblings, parents, or other relatives while their reports were dismissed as attention-seeking or imagination? How many adults like me were being systematically destroying while their concerns were attributed to stress or mental instability? I began developing protocols for identifying potential abuse in medical settings, particularly cases where symptoms didn't match known conditions and family dynamics included unusual caregiving patterns. My research on medical abuse by family members became foundational reading for residents and attending physicians, helping them recognize signs that might otherwise be missed. The work felt like the most important thing I'd ever done. Each case where we identified systematic harm, each family where we intervened before permanent damage occurred, each victim who was believed and protected rather than dismissed and endangered, all of it represented the positive transformation of my own trauma into expertise that could save other people from similar suffering. 3 years after completing my fellowship, I was invited to speak at the American Medical Association's annual conference about family-perpetrated medical abuse. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of physicians who could influence how thousands of potential victims were treated, I felt the full weight of my journey from victim to advocate. Colleagues, I began, I'm here to discuss a form of abuse that's often hidden in plain sight, systematic harm disguised as care, perpetrated by family members who use their access and our trust to cause suffering while maintaining their reputation as devoted relatives. I shared Emma's story, Rachel's story, Jennifer's story, and my own, weaving them together into a comprehensive picture of how family-perpetrated medical abuse operated and how healthcare professionals could learn to recognize it. I talked about the importance of believing patients when they reported feeling worse after eating food prepared by specific family members, about taking seriously any instincts that suggested harmful family dynamics, about understanding that abuse could happen in any family, regardless of education, socioeconomic status, or public presentation. The response was overwhelming. Physicians approached me afterward with their own stories of cases they'd suspected but hadn't known how to investigate, patients they'd dismissed as paranoid who might have been trying to report systematic abuse, families where the most helpful member had turned out to be the most dangerous. But the most meaningful response came from Dr. Patricia Henley, my former chief at Johns Hopkins, who'd driven to the conference specifically to hear my presentation. Vera, she said afterward, when I first met you, you were a talented resident who seemed to struggle with confidence and self-advocacy. Watching you transform your trauma into expertise that's protecting other people, it's been remarkable to witness. The trauma taught me what to look for, I replied. The healing taught me how to use that knowledge to help others. Have you considered writing a book about your experience? Not just the medical aspects, but the personal journey of surviving family betrayal and building a life on your own terms. The suggestion stayed with me for months. I'd become comfortable discussing the clinical aspects of my experience, but sharing the emotional journey of family estrangement, of choosing justice over family loyalty, of building an identity independent of other people's approval, that felt more vulnerable and potentially more valuable. I began writing during quiet evenings in my Philadelphia apartment, the same space where I'd first learned to live without fear of poisoned meals or surprise visits from family members who'd prioritized my attacker's comfort over my safety. The words came slowly at first, then in torrents as I processed not just what had happened, but what I'd learned about resilience, about trust, about the difference between family and people who truly cared about my well-being. The book, titled Poisoned Trust: A Doctor's Journey from Victim to Advocate, was published 2 years later. It became required reading in medical schools across the country, not just for its clinical insights, but for its exploration of how trauma could be transformed into expertise, how survival could become advocacy, how speaking truth could prevent other people from suffering similar betrayals. But the most rewarding responses came from readers who wrote to say the book had helped them recognize their own situations, trust their own instincts, and seek help for abuse they'd been told to minimize or ignore. Letters from adult children who'd finally understood that their family's treatment wasn't normal, from medical professionals who'd learned to listen differently to patients reporting unexplained symptoms, from survivors of various forms of family abuse who'd found validation and hope in the story of someone who'd escaped, healed, and built a meaningful life from the ruins of broken trust. One letter from a young woman named Maya particularly moved me. Dr. Walsh, I've been getting sick every time I visit my grandmother, but my family says I'm being dramatic and ungrateful. After reading your book, I asked my doctor to test for toxins. The results came back positive for plant-based poisons. My grandmother had been putting toxic herbs in my tea because she thought I was too independent and needed to learn to rely on family more. Thank you for teaching me to trust my instincts and seek evidence instead of accepting gaslighting.
Maya's grandmother was arrested and charged with attempted poisoning. Maya recovered fully and maintained no contact with family members who'd refused to believe her even after the evidence was undeniable. Her story became another example of how sharing truth about family abuse could literally save lives. 5 years after my sister's final sentencing, I was approached by the FBI to consult on cases involving family-perpetrated medical abuse. My expertise in recognizing patterns, understanding perpetrator psychology, and supporting victims through the legal process had become valuable enough that federal law enforcement wanted my input on particularly complex cases. The work was challenging in ways that required careful attention to my own emotional boundaries. Each case brought back memories of my own experience. Each victim's story resonated with familiar themes of trust betrayed and instincts dismissed. But it also felt like the ultimate transformation of my trauma into protection for others, using what I'd learned from being victimized to prevent other people from suffering similar harm. One case involved a family where 3 siblings had been systematically poisoned by their mother over a period of years. The mother, Dr. Margaret Thornton, was herself a physician who'd used her medical knowledge to slowly damage her children's health while maintaining her reputation as a devoted single parent raising successful kids. The eldest son, David, had died from organ failure that had been attributed to a rare genetic condition. The middle daughter, Lisa, had survived with permanent kidney damage that had ended her athletic scholarship and derailed her plans for a military career. The youngest son, Michael, had been rescued when a teacher noticed the pattern of his illnesses coinciding with school holidays and family visits. Dr. Walsh, Michael told me during our first meeting, everyone says my mother loved us, that she was just overwhelmed trying to raise 3 kids alone after our father died. But I remember her watching us when we got sick, like she was studying our symptoms, and she always seemed happiest when we were too weak to fight with her or question her decisions. The case was particularly complex because Dr. Thornton had used her medical expertise to create symptoms that mimicked various legitimate conditions, making it nearly impossible for other physicians to recognize systematic poisoning. She'd also manipulated the children's understanding of their symptoms, convincing them that their suffering was genetic, inevitable, and best managed through complete dependence on her care. She taught us that independence was dangerous for people with our condition, Lisa explained, that we needed to stay close to home, avoid stress, let her manage our health decisions. Anyone who suggested we could live normal lives was ignorantly putting us at risk. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as the physical poisoning, creating not just illness but learned helplessness that made the children complicit in their own abuse. They'd been trained to see their mother's control as protection and their own desires for autonomy as dangerous delusions. Working with survivors of such extensive manipulation required techniques I'd developed through my own recovery process. We focused on distinguishing between protective instincts and fear-based compliance, between genuine care and controlling behavior disguised as concern, between family loyalty and enabling abuse. The hardest part, David's widow told me, is understanding that I was married to someone whose mother had been slowly killing him our entire relationship, and none of us recognized it. He died thinking he had a genetic condition, grateful to his mother for taking such good care of him. He never knew that his devoted caregiver was actually his murderer. Dr. Thornton received multiple life sentences for murder, attempted murder, and child abuse, but the case highlighted how family-perpetrated medical abuse could operate for years without detection, particularly when the perpetrator had medical knowledge and the victims had been conditioned to interpret their suffering as inevitable rather than criminal. My consultation work expanded to include training programs for child protective services, medical professionals, and law enforcement agencies. I developed assessment tools for identifying potential family-perpetrated abuse, interview techniques for supporting victims without re-traumatizing them, and protocols for gathering evidence in cases where traditional investigative methods might be insufficient. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply satisfying. Each training session represented hundreds of professionals who might recognize abuse they'd previously missed. Each protocol implemented meant potential victims whose suffering might be identified and stopped. Each conviction obtained meant someone dangerous removed from society and prevented from causing further harm. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my advocacy work was the relationships I built with other survivors. People like Rachel Morrison, who'd become a leading researcher in medical ethics and patient safety. People like Emma Peterson, who'd grown up to study criminal justice with a focus on family violence. People like Michael Thornton, who'd become a social worker specializing in helping children escape abusive family situations. We formed an informal network of survivors turned advocates, sharing resources, supporting each other through difficult cases, and working together to transform our individual traumas into collective expertise that could protect vulnerable people.
The life I'd built from the ruins of family betrayal was more meaningful, more impactful, and more genuinely satisfying than anything I could have achieved if I remained trapped in toxic family dynamics. I thought about the pediatric patients I'd saved, the families I'd helped heal, the medical professionals I'd trained to recognize abuse, the survivors I'd supported through their own journeys toward justice and recovery. All of it had grown from the worst thing that had ever happened to me, transformed through intentional choice into the best work I'd ever done. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Rachel Morrison, calling from her office at the Medical Ethics Institute she now directed. Vera, I wanted you to be the first to know. We just received approval for the Family Abuse Research Center we've been proposing. Full funding for 5 years with the possibility of renewal. We're going to be able to study these patterns systematically, develop better detection methods, and train thousands of medical professionals to recognize what we learn to identify through our own survival. The research center would be named after Jennifer Chen, the young doctor who died from poisoning before anyone realized what was happening to her. Her legacy would be protecting other people from similar fates, ensuring that future victims were identified and rescued rather than dismissed and destroyed. They want you to serve as the clinical director, Rachel continued. The position would involve overseeing all research projects, developing training protocols, and supervising the treatment of identified victims. Are you interested? I looked around my apartment, at the life I'd built through careful choices and hard-won healing, at the evidence of how far I'd traveled from the confused, sick resident who'd once doubted her own perceptions while being slowly murdered by someone she trusted. Yes, I said, I'm very interested. The work would be challenging, demanding, and emotionally complex, but it would also represent the ultimate transformation of trauma into purpose, survival into service, personal healing into collective protection. I'd survived something designed to kill me, exposed truth that others wanted hidden, sought justice when family loyalty demanded silence, and built a life that honored both my recovery and my responsibility to other vulnerable people. The scared young woman who'd once called her parents to report being poisoned, only to be dismissed as paranoid and dramatic, had become someone whose expertise protected other people from similar betrayals. The daughter, who'd been erased from family narratives, had written herself into history as someone who'd refused to accept abuse disguised as care. That night, I began planning my transition to the research center, thinking about the protocols we'd develop, the training programs we'd implement, the survivors we'd support, and the lives we'd save through evidence-based approaches to recognizing and responding to family-perpetrated abuse. I'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened or forgiving people who'd refused to acknowledge their harm. Healing was about transforming suffering into strength, using knowledge gained through survival to protect other people from similar trauma, and building a life that honored both what I'd endured and what I'd overcome. The blood work had proved everything about the poisoning, but the years since had proved everything about my capacity to survive, heal, and transform even the worst betrayal into meaningful protection for others. I was no longer the victim of my sister's attempted murder. I was the author of my own story, the architect of my own healing, and the protector of people who deserved to be believed when they reported that something was wrong in their families. And that was exactly who I'd chosen to become. 15 years later, I stood before the largest medical conference in the world, delivering the keynote address on family-perpetrated medical abuse. The auditorium held 3,000 physicians, and behind me on the massive screen was a photograph I'd never expected to see again, my sister's mugshot from her first arrest, displayed alongside statistics that would have been unimaginable when this all began. Since 2019, protocols developed from survivor testimony have identified over 2,847 cases of family-perpetrated medical abuse, I announced to the silent audience. Of those cases, 2,103 victims survived because healthcare professionals knew what to look for.
744 perpetrators are currently serving sentences that range from 15 years to life in prison. The numbers represented individual human beings, people like Emma Peterson, who is now Dr. Emma Peterson, specializing in emergency medicine with a focus on domestic violence detection. People like Michael Thornton, whose advocacy work had led to mandatory reporting protocols in 12 states. People like Rachel Morrison, whose research had fundamentally changed how medical schools taught students to recognize systematic abuse. But they also represented the lives that had been lost before we'd learned to identify these patterns. Jennifer Chen's death had catalyzed changes that saved thousands of other people, but it couldn't restore the children she'd planned to treat or the medical discoveries she might have made. The case that started this research, I continued, clicking to the next slide, began with a young medical resident who felt sick after eating meals prepared by a family member. For weeks, her symptoms were attributed to stress, fatigue, and the demands of medical training. Her own family suggested she was becoming paranoid and recommended psychiatric evaluation. I paused, looking out at faces that reflected my own experience back to me. Physicians who understood the pressure to dismiss their own symptoms, who knew how easy it was to attribute unexplained illness to work stress, who recognized the vulnerability that came with trusting family members to provide care during times of exhaustion. That resident survived because she trusted her medical training over family gaslighting. She insisted on comprehensive testing despite being told she was overreacting. She pursued justice despite being asked to prioritize family harmony over personal safety. And most importantly, she chose to transform her trauma into expertise that could protect other people from similar harm. The presentation continued for 90 minutes, covering everything from detection protocols to legal precedents to support systems for survivors. But the core message remained consistent: belief in victims, trust in evidence, and commitment to justice even when it disrupted comfortable family narratives. During the question period, a young physician raised her hand. Dr. Walsh, what would you say to medical professionals who suspect family-perpetrated abuse but worry about destroying family relationships with false accusations? The question struck at the heart of every barrier I'd encountered throughout this journey: the assumption that family preservation was more important than individual safety, that maintaining relationships mattered more than protecting vulnerable people from harm. I would say that relationships built on systematic abuse were already destroyed before you identified them, I replied. Your responsibility is to document evidence and protect potential victims, not to preserve family dynamics that enable ongoing harm. False accusations are rare when proper protocols are followed, but missed cases of genuine abuse are often fatal. Another hand went up. How do you personally handle the ongoing impact of what you experienced? Do you still struggle with trust issues or hypervigilance around food and family relationships? The personal question caught me off guard, but I realized it was important for other medical professionals to understand that survival didn't mean complete healing, that expertise could coexist with ongoing vulnerability. I still prefer to prepare my own meals when possible. I still notice when people watch me eat or ask detailed questions about my health. I still maintain careful boundaries with family members and romantic partners. But I've learned to distinguish between protective awareness and limiting fear. The hypervigilance that once felt like a burden has become a professional asset that helps me recognize concerning patterns in patients and families. After the presentation, I was approached by hundreds of physicians with their own stories: cases they'd identified using protocols we'd developed, patients they'd saved by believing symptoms that family members had dismissed, colleagues who'd been helped when suspicious behavior was investigated rather than ignored. But the most meaningful interaction came from Dr. Patricia Chen, Jennifer's younger sister, who'd become a pediatric surgeon inspired by her sister's memory. Dr. Walsh, she said, tears streaming down her face, I want you to know that Jennifer's death wasn't meaningless. The research center named after her has saved more lives than she could have treated in an entire career. You turned our family's tragedy into protection for thousands of other families. Your sister's legacy extends far beyond what any of us could have imagined, I replied, embracing this young woman who'd transformed her grief into purpose, just as I'd transformed my survival into service. That evening, alone in my hotel room overlooking the city where this conference was being held, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from victim to keynote speaker, from someone whose family had dismissed her as paranoid to someone whose expertise was sought by medical professionals worldwide. The physical scars from chronic poisoning were barely noticeable now. Some kidney function reduction that required monitoring, some neurological sensitivity that made me careful about certain medications, some digestive issues that reminded me daily of what I'd survived. But these remnants of trauma had become integrated into a life that was fuller, more purposeful, and more authentically mine than anything I could have built while still trapped in toxic family dynamics. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel. Watched your keynote online. Magnificent as always. Quick update, the Family Abuse Research Center just received its largest grant ever. We'll be able to expand internationally and train medical professionals in 43 countries. Your sister tried to create a blueprint for destroying families. Instead, you created a blueprint for protecting them. I set the phone aside and walked to the hotel window, looking down at the city lights that represented millions of individual lives, thousands of families, hundreds of potential victims who might be protected by the work we'd done. Somewhere in those lights was someone feeling sick after family meals, someone whose concerns were being dismissed as stress or imagination, someone who needed a medical professional trained to recognize patterns of systematic abuse. The work would continue long after I was gone. The protocols would be refined, the training expanded, the detection methods improved.
But the core principle would remain the same: believing victims, trusting evidence, and choosing protection over comfort, even when the truth disrupted family narratives that seemed too devastating to accept. I thought about my sister, dead now for 5 years, but whose attempted murder had launched a movement that protected more people than she could have destroyed in a dozen lifetimes. She'd tried to erase me from existence, but instead had created the catalyst for work that would outlive both of us. I thought about my parents, who'd never contacted me after Melody's final sentencing, who'd apparently decided that a daughter seeking justice was more threatening to their worldview than a daughter attempting murder. Their choice had clarified everything about the family dynamics I'd spent decades trying to navigate. I thought about the life I've built from the ruins of those relationships: meaningful work, genuine friendships, romantic relationships based on trust and respect rather than obligation and fear, a sense of purpose that came from protecting vulnerable people rather than enabling harmful ones. The scared resident who'd once called home to report being poisoned had become someone whose voice carried weight in medical conferences, whose research shaped international protocols, whose survival story gave hope to victims worldwide. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't happened without intention, therapy, and careful attention to building healthy relationships with people who'd proven they could be trusted. But it happened, completely, thoroughly, permanently. My work phone rang, the emergency line I maintained for cases that couldn't wait for business hours. I answered to find Detective Sarah Chen from the Baltimore Police Department. Sarah Chen, the prosecutor's daughter who'd followed her mother into law enforcement. Dr. Walsh, I'm sorry to call so late, but we have a situation that requires your expertise. 3 siblings in the same family have been admitted to different hospitals with identical symptoms over the past 6 months. The parents claim it's a genetic condition, but the pattern matches everything in your protocols for family-perpetrated abuse. What do you need from me? We need you to interview the children individually, assess the family dynamics, and determine whether we're looking at a medical condition or systematic poisoning. The youngest victim is only 7 years old. I was already reaching for my travel bag, already mentally preparing for the interview techniques that might reveal truth while protecting vulnerable children from further trauma. I'll be there in 4 hours, have social services standing by, and make sure the children are separated from the suspected perpetrator until we understand what's happening. Already done. Dr. Walsh, thank you. Your work has literally saved lives in our jurisdiction, and we don't take that lightly. 4 hours later, I was sitting in a hospital room with a 7-year-old girl named Lucy, whose symptoms matched mine with terrifying precision. But unlike my experience, Lucy's concerns were being taken seriously by medical professionals trained to recognize systematic abuse, investigated by law enforcement familiar with family-perpetrated crimes, and supported by social services equipped to protect children from dangerous family members. Lucy, I said gently, I want you to know that feeling sick isn't your fault, and noticing patterns in your symptoms shows that you're very smart and observant. My mommy says I have the same sickness that makes my brothers weak, and that we need special medicine that only she knows how to make. What does the special medicine taste like?
Bitter, but Mommy says it's good for us, even when it makes us feel worse. The investigation revealed that Lucy's mother had been poisoning all 3 children with substances designed to create chronic illness, convincing them that they had a genetic condition that required her specialized care. The children had been homeschooled to avoid outside detection, isolated from extended family who might notice concerning patterns, and trained to see their suffering as inevitable rather than criminal. But this time, a pediatric nurse had recognized symptoms from training materials based on my research. This time, authorities had protocols for investigating suspected family abuse. This time, the children were believed, protected, and rescued before permanent damage occurred. Lucy and her brothers recovered completely after being removed from their mother's care. Their mother received a life sentence for child abuse and attempted murder. The children were placed with relatives who supported their healing and never asked them to forgive someone who'd systematically harmed them. Standing in that hospital, watching Lucy play with toys for the first time without fear of being watched or judged, I understood that this was why I'd survived. Not just to heal myself, but to protect other people from similar trauma. Not just to seek justice for what had been done to me, but to prevent future victims from suffering comparable harm. The work continued. More cases, more training programs, more protocols developed and refined. More survivors who chose to transform their trauma into expertise. More victims rescued before suffering became fatal. More perpetrators held accountable before they could cause additional harm. But perhaps most importantly, more families where children like Lucy learned that their perceptions mattered, that adults could listen to their concerns and act to protect them, that survival was possible even when the people who claimed to love them had tried to destroy them. Years passed. The research center expanded globally. Medical schools integrated family abuse detection into standard curricula. Law enforcement agencies adopted investigation protocols that prioritized victim safety over family preservation. Social services developed support systems specifically designed for survivors of family-perpetrated medical abuse. The work became my legacy, but it also became larger than any individual contribution. Rachel Morrison's research, Emma Peterson's emergency protocols, Michael Thornton's advocacy, all of it combined into a movement that had fundamentally changed how medical professionals, law enforcement, and social services responded to suspected family abuse. On my 60th birthday, I received a letter that summarized everything this journey had meant. It was from Dr. Lucy Patterson, formerly the 7-year-old girl whose rescue had demonstrated how far our detection capabilities had evolved. Dr. Walsh, she wrote, I'm graduating from medical school next month, specializing in pediatric emergency medicine with a focus on child abuse detection. I want you to know that your work saved my life, but more than that, it taught me that survival could be transformed into service, that trauma could become expertise, that even the worst betrayal could be turned into protection for other people. I'm named the Lucy Walsh Fellowship in Family Abuse Detection at my medical school, not because I want my name associated with what was done to me, but because I want your name associated with what you did about it. You showed me that being a victim was temporary, but being a protector could be permanent. Thank you for teaching me that my experience mattered, that my recovery was possible, and that my future could be built on helping other people rather than hiding from my past. Reading Lucy's letter, I realized that the circle had completed itself. The scared, sick resident who'd once doubted her own perceptions had become someone whose name would be associated with protecting vulnerable children for generations of medical professionals to come. But more than that, I'd helped create a legacy where victims became advocates, where survival became service, where the worst things that happened to people could be transformed into the best work they'd ever do. The blood work had proved everything about the poisoning. The decades since have proved everything about the power of choosing truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty, and protection of the vulnerable over preservation of harmful dynamics. I'd survived something designed to kill me, exposed truth that others wanted hidden, sought justice when family demanded silence, and built a life that honored both my recovery and my responsibility to other victims. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or forgiving. Healing was about transforming suffering into strength, using survival to serve others, and ensuring that the harm done to you never happened to anyone else if you could prevent it. That was the real victory. Not just surviving my sister's attempt to murder me, but ensuring that her techniques could never again be used to destroy other families without detection and intervention. I'd become exactly who I'd needed when I was being poisoned. Someone who listened to victims, believed evidence over family narratives, and fought for justice even when it disrupted comfortable lies. And that was exactly who I'd chosen to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.